Now, I don't know about you, but somehow it's rather strange when the holiday season comes. Everyone would like to stop in by the Starbucks, the coffee shop. And some believe that coffee has always been the most mesmerizing and also this promising gift to friends, to neighbors, even to family, and also to the community members. But here's the thing, that one thing if you notice that Starbucks today in China are particularly actually struggling from this economic standpoint. And we know there are so many coffee brands are competing with Starbucks. Now, some believe this is more than just economic factors and has a lot more to do with the political reasons. Now, when we talk about the political reasons today, it's not just about what's happening within the international community. It's really more about this diplomatic approach, and some countries today are hoping that in this upcoming year in 2025, there can be a better solution and especially avoid the major conflict. In this year that we're seeing so many wars and conflicts around the world. Now, at this moment, we need to understand, can we restore the political sanity or even what we call economic stability back to the world? And what about the country of Iran? And this is not the first time that we address what's happening in this country. Now, as we're approaching 2025, it's better that we need to bring the country back on the table to talk about, is it even possible to understand the peace, stability, and also the sanity among the political leaders in this country. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Professor Jamshid Choksi. Professor Choksi is a distinguished professor, and he's a former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and former chair of the Department of Central Eurasia Studies. And he's currently the director of Inner Asia and Uralic National Resources Center at Indiana University, Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksi, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me back, Will.
Well, Professor Choksi, as we mentioned in the intro, surely 2024 has been a very busy year for all of us. Now, this is not the first time that you and I would discuss the nation of Iran. But again, as we're looking ahead to 2025, let's start with the possibility that to restore the sanity or even to understand the peace or stability in this country. Because recently some articles believe that the Islamic Republic is open to negotiation and especially with America. And we know that 2024, this U.S. presidential election has sent shockwave to the international community. So how much do we believe from your expertise that it's possible that Iran today, it's open to negotiate with the countries such as U.S.? Let's start from there. What do you think?
I think that there is certainly a very reasonable possibility that Iran, for its own reasons, is more open going into 2025 than it has been in the past. One such reason is, of course, that Iran's proxies across the Middle East have been decimated in the last few months. Hezbollah, Hamas, and most of all, its ally, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, has been ousted. Now, on the one hand, that has been a great setback for Iran's regional exploits. So that makes it more vulnerable. We've also seen Israel directly attack Iran's capabilities from outside Iran, and supposedly most of Iran's air defenses have been destroyed. However, Iran still has tremendous nuclear capability, and the unknown factor is whether all these setbacks will make the leadership of Iran more likely to go towards being a nuclear power for self-protection. So that is one possibility. The other possibility is, of course, that they attempt to tone down the tension, work with the incoming Trump administration, try to reach a deal. Now, interestingly, incoming President Trump, of course, is notoriously capricious. We all know that. But on the other hand, he has always wanted to keep the United States out of wars. And if that prevails, and he has said he's open to both negotiate with Iran and also clobber Iran. So if the negotiation prevails, there is an opportunity there. That opportunity cannot just bring Iran back into the global framework. It can also help stabilize the Middle East because despite Iran's setback, even Syria, any resolution in Syria has to involve Israeli cooperation, Lebanese cooperation, Turkish cooperation, Saudi, the Gulf Emirates, the United States, Russia, but also Iran. And so there are many variable parts, as you said, as we go into 2025. It's trying hard to read the crystal ball of what the future holds. There are great possibilities, and of course, many dangers.
I think, Professor Choksi, and I believe that when we talk about foreign policy, again, you mentioned the crystal balls, but I think that it's better that we not to trust using magic 8-ball to answer all the questions, right? Because when it comes to foreign policy for Iran, it's not just yes or no, or it's not just ask me the question again. Now, let's get to the next question. Some believe that today the Iranian government is trying to adopt what we called a flexible foreign policy, prioritizing the diplomatic engagement and also constructive dialogue rather than relying on this what we called outdated paradigm. Now, from your perspective, how should we understand or even unwrap this what we called diplomatic engagement? Because again, countries such as Iran, such as US and Turkey, Syria, are all based on different political ideology. And I don't just mean democracy. I mean that we talk about human rights and we talk about weaponization of the political system. And also we're seeing this transition of this economic shift as well. So from your perspective, how do we think that US or even any other countries are able to understand this what we called a diplomatic engagement? And why should we believe the current Iranian government is willing to be flexible? It's willing even to use the word adaptable to the changes, and especially we're looking at post-US presidential election. Your thoughts?
So this is interesting. I think the proof lies in what Iran has been doing over the last couple of years. About a year ago, I co-authored a piece in Foreign Affairs called "Iran is Breaking Out of the Box," and essentially what we began to see then, which has continued, is that Iran has restored diplomatic relations and also commercial relations with the Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with all the regional countries. It is re-engaged very actively. It is now working to re-establish relations with Egypt, with relations across the countries in North Africa. So Iran has made a very concerted effort to buttress its military capabilities with the diplomatic capabilities, understanding that you could lose one, you need the other. And as we have seen now, as it's been set back in the military regime, these diplomatic ties have become very important, and those continue to persist even after the temporary setbacks. So what I think we should see is that Iran will be open because it does need to be involved in the region. And ultimately, let's keep something in mind. Even foreign policy is domestic. It ultimately comes back to domestic issues. And Iran right now is having, even though it has great oil reserves and gas reserves, its capability to produce electricity, as you may know, has diminished. There are blackouts that are affecting industry, and those things can help destabilize the regime. And therefore, the regime is trying to be very careful to ensure that the more it can reintegrate, the better it stands. So that, from an internal point of view, makes Iran open to working with the United States. Certainly, it has been working with China. It is closely allied with Russia. So there are opportunities. Now, whether those opportunities will materialize, that is the unknown, because then it's no longer with Iran. That also depends on the United States. It depends on Russia. It depends on what good officers China can play, and it also depends on Israel.
Professor Choksi, I mean, again, when we look at the nation of Iran, and there's no surprise that this country, not just in the year of 2024, I mean, previously that has been through so much, and we're talking about wars, and we talk about sectarian conflict and terrorism. And also, you alluded to that, what's happening in the nation of Syria today. How much do you think that the Iranian government has learned about the changes that are around the world? And of course, that we know that today is not a case of polarization. We're looking at multipolarization of the political system. So from your perspective, how do you think that the country is able to navigate and able to understand the current affairs? And surely that no one would like to see another country, no one would like to see another regime that fall into the hands of terrorism. But meanwhile, it's still important to understand this economic agenda, energy security, and the freedom of navigation, etc. So what is Iran, I guess, what has Iran learned so far, and why do you think that the current government is still slowly, I mean, not in a fast way, but slowly pacing itself towards a new direction? Why do you think of that?
I think that is because Iran is increasingly seeing, as you pointed out, the multipolar nature, not just of the world, but even of the region. The Arab states have become more involved. Their relations with Israel have changed. And these are economic ties, which will endure despite political issues. And so Iran is learning to adapt. And there are other reasons. So Iran has always used the threat of closing down the Persian Gulf as a threat to blockade the world's oil and gas supplies. But even that threat is now gradually dissipating because pipelines are being built by the Arab countries to reach other ports beyond the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf, in the long run, the Persian Gulf's importance as a navigation means to transport oil will diminish. Likewise, if the North-South corridor works, connecting Russia through Iran to the Indian Ocean, that then becomes another economic pipeline. But as economic ties, Belt Road increases. Those changes, I think, are compelling Iran to realize that military power, even nuclear power, is far less important than being able to deal with one's neighbors, that economic clout carries a great say. And so I think Iran is realizing that, and it's also realizing that its lack of economic power is perhaps the greatest threat to its own stability. Because ultimately, the outbreak of revolutions are unpredictable. Find what sets off a spark, whether it was, the Arab Spring, Syria now, the Iranian Revolution itself of 1979. It was a newspaper article in 1978 that was the final trigger. So, but those final sparks arise because of larger economic issues. If you think of the Arab Spring, it was preceded by many years of drought and economic failure across the Middle East. So Iran right now is facing a great deal of internal economic instability. And that is a far greater threat to the regime than Israel, the United States, terrorism, anything else. And I think that the current Iranian government is being compelled to pay more attention to that.
Professor Choksi, I mean, let's talk about the U.S. And again, during the first term of Donald Trump, that one of the, I guess we say, the signatory projects or signatory decision is to withdraw the nuclear deal. I mean, again, of course, this was not well received or well celebrated within the international community. And also, just based on the research that the number of officials in Iran has dramatically increased, and because of what Donald Trump did during the first term. Now, it's really hard to imagine that any of this would happen for his upcoming new term starting 2025. So, from your perspective, how do we understand this Iran deal today? I mean, again, I'm not going to ask you whether President Trump is going to bring it back on the table, but what do you think will be the most tangible and most feasible solution if we continue to see that Trump decide to take bolder steps, or even Iran is willing to have a dialogue with the U.S.? But how do we understand this Iran deal, and how do you think that both sides should understand the importance of working together, not creating conflict with each other? Your thoughts?
Well, that's a really good question because, as you pointed out, the net result of withdrawing from the JCPOA was that there are two things happened. One, there was a withdrawal from the JCPOA, and then there was maximum pressure, as the Trump administration, the previous Trump administration called it. But the result, there are two results. One, yes, the economic calamities of Iran increased. However, that did not stop Iran from increasing its nuclear program. Yet, it should also be added that while Iran suffered economically, and while it did increase its nuclear program, even at the expense of other economic factors, Iran still did not cross the breakout threshold. And even now, even though there are mounting voices in Iran, and I co-authored an article just a few months ago, as you know, about whether Iran would cross the nuclear threshold, and that's the danger. That is, if Iran were to feel more threatened and more isolated, it may indeed make that move. On the other hand, it knows that if it made that move, it probably would face even more economic pressure. And so it's going to be this balancing act both inside Iran, but also, yes, the other unknown variable is the Trump administration has made it clear that we should expect maximum pressure 2.0. That's made very clear. Now, whether that 2.0 will simply be pressure for pressure's sake, or whether it will ultimately also dovetail with attempts to bring back a deal. Because the one thing that former and incoming President Trump always likes is a deal. He always talks about, he likes making deals.
That's
and
right.
They just have to be his deals. And so maybe, let's face it, a feather in his cap, certainly across the international community, would be if he had a deal with Iran. The whole international community would breathe a sigh of relief. President Trump may actually get the Nobel Peace Prize that he always wants, Because let's be honest here. I mean, that would be a major accomplishment. Now, that's the unknown. And the reality is that these things often also spin out of control, even of the most powerful people in the world. There's always this impression that the president of the United States can do whatever he wants to. And the reality is we know that no national leader can ultimately do what they want to. There are too many, as you pointed out, the world is too multipolar. There are too many players. But here is the if I may loop China into this also. China, again, Trump is coming in talking about pressure on China. The question therefore becomes, is it going to be pressure for pressure's sake, or is it pressure to create situations where nations want to work more together? And so it's the outcome. We saw the withdrawing from the JCPOA last time didn't work. Will there be a way forward? And I think there is an expectation that Iran is open. Trump has said repeatedly, on the one hand, he talks about maximum pressure, but he also talks about he's ready for a deal. So He talks about pressure on China, but he also talks about being ready for a deal. So, maybe this will be an era of great deal making. Let's hope so.
Well, again, Professor Chopsy, let's hope that Donald Trump is able to bring deals on the table and also able to bring the dialogues and back on the table. Now, two more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about Hezbollah and Hamas. Now, again, you mentioned at the beginning, Professor Chokshi, that organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas are grassroots liberation movement that emerged in response to occupation, of course, will continue to play a significant roles on the world stage. Now, from your perspective, again, we're seeing what's happening in Syria. We're seeing what's happening in Turkey and also in many other critical countries. How do you think that Iran is able to understand the presence of Hezbollah and Hamas? I mean, again, those organizations, let's be honest, they're not the favorites of the international community. And of course, the U.S., regardless who is in charge of the White House, regardless who's in charge of the military, U.S. has vowed to eliminate or completely eliminate Hezbollah and Hamas for decades. But it's a slow progress. And again, we've seen ups and downs. So from your perspective, seeing the presence of Hezbollah and Hamas, such as the called liberation movement, what is going to happen to Iran when they're looking at the presence of those two organizations? And for this upcoming year, how do you think that Iran is going to, I want to be careful, not the word balance, but the word to handle the presence of organizations like this? Your thoughts?
And that's a very interesting question, because hitherto, Iran has gradually co-opted Hamas and co-opted Hezbollah and used them essentially as military arms to, if not destabilize, but at least to keep Israel and the rest of the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, shall we say, unsettled. The Hezbollah and Hamas's military capabilities have been greatly degraded. However, particularly Hezbollah, but Hamas as well, they are grassroots organizations in the sense that they also provide and have provided in the past social services. They are, in some ways, also, they've become intrinsic parts of the community. Granted, they may serve particular constituents, but they do serve constituencies. And so the issue going forward will be for Iran, but also, I would say, for Israel, for the United States, and for the Arab countries. How do we approach those organizations so that they may play constructive roles? Any resolution of the Palestinian issue has to include some aspect, if not Hamas in its current form, then some Palestinian representation. Certainly, Lebanon, the Lebanese polity does include approximately 40% Shia Muslims who are ultimately represented by Hezbollah. And so that role of Hezbollah, let's say the non-military aspect, has to be reshaped and made viable. And so the question for the Iranian leadership will be whether they see this as an opportunity to be engaged in rebuilding the, shall we say, the regional aspects of those organizations in constructive ways, or whether they take an opportunity to rebuild it simply in a military way. Now, again, the other countries of the world, also the United States, China, and Russia, have a say in this, that in whether Iran gets the capability and opportunity to rebuild those in a military sense. Those organizations will continue to exist in one form or another, or they will morph into others. The question will be whether they can be directed into, let's say, Hezbollah becoming more part of an integrated Lebanese state, as opposed to a failed nation. Whatever happens with the West Bank and with Gaza, the Palestinian issue does need some resolution. And therefore, political parties are necessary. Syria does need to be stabilized because even though the current new government that has taken over claims that it has removed and distanced itself from its Islamist roots, it is quite possible for Syria to fall apart. And if Syria were to fall apart, then even if the new government was not to be Islamist, other Islamist groups would get in there. So the larger question, I think, for 2025 is, can the region be stabilized? And can it be stabilized, leaving aside words like democracy and monarchy, can it be stabilized in ways that benefit the local people? And then those people therefore want to be constructive citizens of the Middle East. That I think would be a very important question. And if that were to work, that certainly would benefit the global superpowers as well.
That is a great question. Now, Professor Choksi, I want to end our our conversation by asking you the last question. Now, again, we're looking ahead to 2025. Let's bring China into our conversation. We know that previously that Iran has been quietly but also very actively growing closer to China. And we're seeing this economic, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, and we're seeing this collaboration from all aspects. So from your perspective, putting aside of what's happening in in Syria, in Turkey, any other countries, why do you think it's still critical for the international community, particularly the West, to understand and also to pay closer attention to the relationship between China and Iran for this upcoming year? And even though we know that China has boldly claimed that China has never been interested in interfering any international or any domestic affairs among any other countries. But again, we know that today you cannot be a bench player if you really want to engage in this economic agenda. So for 2025, why do you think it's crucial for the West, for the rest of the world, to understand what Iran and China have in mind? And also, how do you think the messages will be received from this larger perspective? Your final thoughts.
I think that's a fabulous question, particularly as we look into 2025. I think as we look at that, I think we should expand the dynamic, not just China and Iran, but China is not putting all its Middle East, Gulf influence, shall we say, the eggs in one basket, Iran. China is actively involved with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Qatar, with Bahrain. China is gradually becoming more and more an economic power and a player across the Middle East. And I think we should see it in that sense. Now, it of course causes some degree of concern in terms of superpower competition. And yet at the same time, I think that particularly the United States is coming to see the world as not just more complicated, but the possibility of other powers working together, particularly if they can work together, is seen as beneficial. I think the greatest fear of the United States is a China-Russia tag team trying to grab the Middle East. Now, Russia has had a significant presence. China has not in a military sense. And I think if China were to be expanding economically and, shall we say, not taking over, but certainly complementing the US role and becoming a stabilizing factor, I think that would be welcome. Because the world is becoming multipolar. So, and I think Iran is also realizing there was, I think, a point perhaps about a year ago where Iran was more confident that its relationship with China was just a one-to-one. And the regime in Tehran has come to realize that China, that Beijing is looking at the other nations of the Middle East too, and that it is balancing, even in small issues like claims over island Persian Gulf. China has made it more clear that perhaps Iran should be open to dialogue with its Arab neighbors. And so that's a role which I think the United States would welcome. And so going forward, China is going to be present. Russia is going to be present. The United States is certainly going to be present. Israel is going to be present. And Israel has demonstrated that, at least in terms of military technology, that it is the dominant power of the Middle East. Now, Iran has also demonstrated that it can take a licking, but it keeps on ticking. And so it will also be a player going forward. So the best hope would be resolutions where Iran learns to work with the rest of the Middle East. It seems to be on that path.
That's right.
So there we go.
Well, I mean, again, Professor Choksi, end of the 2024, it's rather challenging to know what would happen. I mean, again, we don't know whether President-elect Donald Trump is going to change or even to add on more pressures to the nation of Iran. And also, we're seeing this unpredictable world that post the pandemic. And most importantly, as you mentioned before, it's not just about laying the pressure upon the countries. It's bringing the dialogue back on the table. And again, at the end of the day, for this upcoming new year, no one would like to see another war. And no one would like to see major conflict that really dramatically affect the citizens around the world, and particularly from this economic standpoint. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Professor Jamshid Choksi. Again, Professor Choksi, it's a distinguished professor. And again, his research covers the development of various in Central Asia, Near and South Asia. Again, I really appreciate Professor Choksi's time. And again, for this upcoming year, I'm sure that we're going to have more dialogues with Professor Choksi. Again, thank you so much for doing this, and Merry Christmas, and hope you have amazing New Year. So thank you so much for doing this, Professor Choksi.
Happy holidays, and to your viewers as well. And we look forward to having a wonderful 2025.